I want to welcome everybody. My name is Brent Edwards. I'm a professor in the Department of English and Comparative Literature at Columbia and the Institute for Comparative Literature and Society. And this is the first event in a series called Understanding Systemic Racism that's been organized by the Ambedkar Initiative under the aegis of the Institute for Comparative Literature and Society this fall. This event is going to be a conversation between Professor Gayatri Chakravorty Spivak and two students, or one former student and one current student, Yosan Alemu and Nwakego Nwasike. I want to mention before we begin that the Ambedkar Initiative, this series, has scheduled a number of talks that are going to be announced in the next few days on the ICLS website. If you Google ICLS at Columbia, they include a talk in October, date still to be set, by Etienne Balibar about racial difference, a talk by Suryakant Wagmore on urban democracy on October 23rd, a talk by Nico Slate from Carnegie Mellon on race, caste, and democracy on November 6th. And the series will end with, perhaps fittingly given where we're starting, the third annual Ambedkar lecture that will be given by Isabel Wilkerson, who has written Caste, the Origins of Our Discontents, that I think we will talk about a little bit tonight. There it is. That event will be on November 13th at 6:30 p.m. That event, that Wilkerson event, is only open to Columbia Barnard affiliates. The other events are open to the general public. The way we'll proceed tonight is we'll start with, I will introduce the panelists, and then we'll start with Gayatri giving a talk for, it'll be about 30 minutes, and then we'll shift to a conversation, a dialogue between Gayatri and the two students. So I'll introduce all three now and then turn it over to Gayatri. Yosan Alemu is a fourth-year student at Columbia majoring in Comparative Literature and Society and a Mellon Mays Fellow. She's writing her senior thesis on the books of Blackness, knowledge production, and theories of the human. She's worked on the podcast series for the Ambedkar Initiative, which will be launched next week too. So look out on the website for those podcasts. And Nwakego Nwasike completed her MA in American Studies at Columbia this past May, and she wrote a thesis on the commodification of Black women's reproductive labor. I'm not going to do a full introduction for my colleague Gayatri Spivak because that would take all our time. But Gayatri Chakravorty Spivak is a university professor at Columbia and one of the founders of the Institute for Comparative Literature and Society. Among the more recent of the many books and translations she's published is the 2012 collection, An Aesthetic Education in the Age of Globalization. She's currently working, among other things, on a book entitled Walking with Du Bois, an expansion of the Du Bois lectures that she gave at Harvard. So Gayatri will give a talk, then I will open it up and we'll have a dialogue with questions and a conversation between the Yosan and Nwakego and Gayatri. And then after about an hour or so, I will open it up to questions. For those of you attending the webinar, you should be able to see a Q&A function and you can ask questions through that function, and I will bring in as many as I can. I don't know how many we'll be able to deal with, but we'll do our best. So use the Q&A function once we get to that stage of the dialogue. All right, so I will turn it over to Gayatri.
Thanks, Brent. And thank you, Lydia. Thank you, Anu. Thank you, Sarah, for asking me to open this series. It's quite scary, but I'm not really giving a talk. I'm really making some comments. And I'm sorry that I couldn't cut the comments down so that it was a bit shorter, but I've cut and I've done my best. And I put Woodard on the title because I want to include him among the names that are said in protests for equality of life value for Blacks and whites. I say his name, Isaac Woodard. He earned a battle star for his courage in the Asiatic Pacific Theater. And it's very strange because I was at that time a child in Calcutta, and the US and and British troops were housed quite close to where we lived. And of course, there was this artificial famine, man-made famine, created to feed the US soldiers, so that in the World Health Organization book, you will see that someone born in Calcutta in 1942 was malnourished even if they were in the middle class. So I have bad bones and I have bad muscles and all of that stuff. So we must have shared. So I hope that, I wish that I knew that I had seen him. So he earned a battle star for his courage in the Asiatic Pacific Theater, a campaign medal for unloading ships under enemy fire in New Guinea, and received the Good Conduct Medal as well as the Service Medal and the Second World War Victory Medal. He received an honorable discharge. He wanted to go to the toilet on the bus as he was going to visit his wife, and he had an argument with the driver about making a rest stop in a few miles. The driver stopped the bus and called the police. He was beaten around the head and his eyes were gouged out. Little medical assistance was provided 2 days later. The next day, it took 28 minutes for an all-white jury to acquit the police chief. Here is a photo with his mother. Here is him, and here is a photo with his mother. And perhaps a photo before he was blinded. So I'm not sure that this is actually his photo, but this was on the aid thing. His own memory is that it is because he did not say yes, sir, but yes, that he was actually beaten around the head like that. He lived to be 73 and was taken care of by his family. There is an excellent book on the Woodard case by Judge Richard Gergel. Here is the subtitle, and the subtitle is The Awakening of President Harry S. Truman and Judge J. Waits Waring. Truman did indeed establish the Civil Rights Commission as a result of the case, but changing laws does not change minds, and we are where we are today. Changing laws does not change minds. Changing minds have to remain a persistent effort for every generation. It is not called training, it is called education, and education not as we know it. My revised title is There is no mechanism for accountability, something I heard on MSNBC this morning from a woman whose name I didn't catch, clearly a strong anti-racist person with a British accent. The goal of this series, as Brent mentioned, is understanding systemic racism to reflect, I quote still, to reflect on the deeper roots of racism and the possibility of radical social transformation. To think, I'm still quoting, to think critically and rigorously about the emerging conditions of social change. Radical social transformation, understanding systemic racism, reflect on the deeper roots of racism, to think critically and rigorously about the emerging conditions of social change. This, I say, will not be fulfilled by simply congratulating Isabel Wilkerson really for what I think is a fantastic book. It really is a book worth reading and rereading. But these tasks will not be fulfilled by simply congratulating Isabel Wilkerson for actually understanding what B.R. Ambedkar stood for. I have written about the missed date, the faux bon, between Du Bois and Ambedkar elsewhere, and their connection through constitutionality. In an extended discussion, I would have to consider the localization of the Dalit movement. I have often suggested that global solidarity is class continuous. Although, of course, it is something to be supported. It is our academic class. Global solidarity is class continuous. I quote here an email from my friend Yashodatta Alone, who is a Dalit professor at elite university in India, JNU, very engaged, Jawaharlal Nehru University. And he's very engaged indeed, and he's just asked me to write on Ambedkar's annihilation of caste. And so I asked him a question, and this is how he answered. Dear Gayatri, yes, there has been involvement from Dalit movements in the Black Lives Matter movement in the USA. There are NGOs and organizations in the US of Dalit groups who have been collaborators in the Black Lives Matter movements and actively participated in their individual capacities. The active Dalit individuals in the US were active. It is only in recent times there has been academic involvement and dialogues have increased between the two groups. The Ambedkarites always had problems with Martin Luther King Jr.'s statement on Gandhi as inspiration and icon of nonviolence and anti-racism. There is a new thinking now with regard to aligning with personas of Gandhi. The Ambedkar Association of North America always participated in Black Lives Matter movements, especially in California, and more specifically in the San Francisco Bay Area. A bit of early work, he continued, has been done in this regard, especially establishment of dialogues between the two groups by Elena Zelliot, and it is only later that active collaboration began. There is a person who is a doctor by profession, Dr. Yogesh Varhade, very active in the US for more than 50 years, and only recently is back to Bombay. These participants are class continuous through academic culture, and their involvement is crucial, but claims to subaltern involvement are often wish fulfillment. And I would, if I had time, like to ask who organized the fantastic meeting in Uttar Pradesh where Dalits sang "We Shall Overcome." I would put in these introductory remarks, I would put another statement on the table. The real untouchables are the looters and the killers. Looters and killers. They cannot be touched if the movement is to go forward. Looting equals buying when there is no legal tender. And according to Martin Luther King, it is the language of the unheard. Al Sharpton pointed out yesterday that, quote, outside agitators is a supremacist formula that we have heard for God knows how long. And Fanon, if there is no response and life is valued less, there is violence. I will insert my private notes here only if you promise that you recognize that they're a product of private rage, okay? This is not a public remark, but I'm sharing it with you because I'm talking about something which is in itself somewhat peculiar. Okay, these are the notes I wrote one day watching something. Why not give the $10,000 each to the looters rather than the small businesses? I saw an extended interview with a fat white guy who owned a ShopRite telling us how badly the community was suffering because this US franchise, which I see all over Nigeria, had been looted. I would like to recommend here Sharon Ife Charles, who works with gang members and drug addicts here. She gives us a good model for sustained work at mind changing. My phrase is rearranging desires, at least as reported by herself on one of de Blasio's televised press conferences. The mayor asks her, is there a specific example that you've sort of cherished of someone who was in the middle of that life of violence, whom you witnessed the process of how they were convinced on a better path? I'm not quite sure how this sentence goes, but he's a native speaker, so I'll let it go. Do you have an example in your mind? And then Ife Charles responds, we have staff. I can speak of one of our staff, and I hope she's okay with it. I'm going to use her first name, Faith. And this is how long someone, this is about education that I was talking about. It's not education like we understand it. This is a very fantastic methodology with which I resonate. And this is how long sometimes we are in a situation right now where we need where we need things to happen, I suppose, expeditiously. And we have to think about how we do it, because there are people who will revert back. Faith is a 30-something-year-old young woman, she says, but Faith was that person out in the streets years ago. When I was young, I was in my mid-20s or 30s. I'm giving my age right now, but part of that was that I had to work with Faith, along with other credible individuals that were out there every single day. Mayor, running in my car to get off the street corners. It took years. And even in that time, I remember when she turned and she had her first child, and she said to me, I'm not ready yet. Because this is the thing, patience. I'm not ready yet, because you can force someone to something and then they revert back quickly. Very fine lesson that she tells us. And 10 years down the line now, Faith is now an employee, right? She's actually working with us, but it took years of us having conversations and her doing trial and error. You didn't want to be in school. What is the alternative to that, right? What else can we do? Now, you have a young woman who has said, I don't want this life anymore. This is not what I want to do. So the other side begins to want. But it did not happen, she says, overnight. And if we are thinking that this is going to happen overnight because we wanted to, it is in our hearts. We no longer want shootings. We'll tell everybody, put the guns down. But there's got to be some alternatives to that. And that work happens every single day. You don't get a break from it. Changing the mindset of someone, you cannot get a break from it, she says. This, I would say, is the ground of persistent practice, securing good laws by rearranging desires so that enforcement is not the only solution in the face of brutality from the enforcers of the law. Let us look, for example, at the enforcers of the law, at the argument of the defending counsel in California versus Coyle, 1967, the first trial that set off what we have finally come to think of as the Watts riots after the Rodney King incidents 30 years later, attempting to undo the verdict against the two black men. This is the example that I want you to look at, the enforcers of the law. Defense counsel argues for due process and the rule of law, and the first word is but. I quote, but if a government of laws, they write, if a government of laws is to be preserved, our justifiable outrage at the behavior of the two black men, whom they are defending, if a government of laws is to be preserved, our justifiable outrage must not result in denying to these defendants a fair trial and a dispassionate review of their appeal. We deplore their acts, but it is fundamental to our system of justice that these defendants be accorded the same treatment under the law as that provided to the least blameworthy of wrongdoers. I mean, they're on our side, they're defending them, but listen to the language, the enforcers. The sad lesson of history, they write, is that any other path leads inevitably to the arbitrary injustice of the tyrant. It is to protect the rights of the innocent as well as the guilty that rules of law must be respected, and therefore that these defendants must be tried a second time. I won't quote the whole thing, but the whole thing is worth reading. In fact, if we read the trial record, which is intertextual with the argument here, we cannot miss, but they did miss, we cannot miss in the cracks of the heartless questioning that is given in the account of California versus Powell. We cannot miss in the cracks of the heartless questioning the incredible life of, and I quote, the insidious pain, the psychic destruction, the torture, the physical and sexual convulsion, the horrendous unending repetition of violence upon violence, the way in which their lives were completely decimated from day to day. This was not read by these defendants, the enforcers of the law. That they just simply took equality before the law as a kind of formula. Equal means equal. Equal means same. No history, no understanding. So this kind of stuff, if they could read, which is why we teach reading, if they could read, then they would understand that this kind of life produces the kind of uncaring violence that is impervious to the fear of death. It is just that there be law, but law, as I have said again and again, is not justice. I've asked my two students, Yosan Alemu and Nwakego Nwasike, to ask me questions because I want to see what questions arise. They were the two best students in my class on Du Bois and Ambedkar last semester, and that is why I chose them. Yosan, although an undergraduate in a class with graduate students, summarized our goals best at the end of the semester, and Nwakego submitted, as you heard, an MA thesis on the commodification of Black reproductive labor, which really took on the much broader topic of racism and capitalism. I want to congratulate Isabel Wilkerson for attempting to take the English word, quote, caste, and expand it to cover, and as she says, it comes from the Portuguese, like fetish. You know why Portuguese? Because they came first to us. To take the English word caste and expand it to cover the internal problem of the situation of the African American person inside the United States and in the world. Although the origin story of the concept caste can't just be covered by the word varna, as she really doesn't suggest. She knows it's very complicated, but you can't really find these origin words, or jat, or jati. I would recommend Colin Renfrew's The Archaeology of Language here, because these are all stories told by us to ourselves as the story of the origin of caste. And since Hinduism is not a scriptural religion, it's not an Abrahamic religion of the book, not Kitabi. In fact, the account in Manu, which she gives as the origin, is not what one learns. Let us, so this story is one among many, many etiologies we have of all different kinds. So therefore, when one hears just the story in Manu, that is simply really a record that is made up and not, I mean, the Dalits, for example, the so-called untouchables in my schools, they perhaps have heard of Manu, but they certainly don't know this story. So what I would suggest is that what one learns much better from the garbage heap archaeologists who can give a better account of, quote, what really happened, as my friend Romeo Thapar tells me. And I would also say that loss of caste is gendered. Yet Wilkerson's kind of extension is what keeps language alive. And I also think any scholarly attempt to act as language police and say, this is not what caste is in its own context, is a grave error. I, of course, won't explain this here and now, but as a kind of rough and ready phenomenologist, I say caste does not exist. That also I put on the table. I am at the moment exposed to the dissatisfaction of mathematical theory with the fact that words cannot be controlled and must therefore be made to mean only one thing. And in fact, or forgotten altogether, so that, as Husserl suggests, we respect the absolute translatability of symbolic mathematical language. This too I put here in this brief discussion for consideration. And I say to Isabel, hey, America is indeed an old house, but as you note again and again, the myriad castes in India has had thousands of years to develop into something that is hard to hold in one text. In fact, there is a certain degree of absurdity in the way in which caste is accepted. Isabel Wilkerson is very good in saying that it is a software. This is a metaphor that I have used for decades now, that assume that changes according to the operative necessity. And that story in India is really worth, I mean, I could go on forever here. But the myriad castes in India, it is hard to hold in one text. Even structural functionalism, which of course it is here as well, a structural functionalism only superficially described in Louis Dumou's terrible Orientalist Homo Hierarchicus, first published in French in 1966. I noticed it still has 4.5 stars in Amazon. And the caste system is not only, as Wilkerson suggests, quote, subconscious, although it is indeed, I quote again, a mutation of that software that adjusts to the updated needs of the operating system. And it is also correct that white people, especially though not only men, become accustomed to the idea of regulating. I suffer from this weekly. And you are on target that the costumes were handed out at birth. Discussing my former student Aniket Jaware's book, Practicing Caste, on touching and not touching at ICLS, people were unable to understand his remark that caste was before gender. It was because when the woman became pregnant, everyone knew, before any kind of technology, everyone knew what caste the child would be. As Isabel Wilkerson quite correctly writes, the costumes were handed out at birth. Jaware, untimely dead, was himself born a Dalit. Isabel, you quote James Spalding, official of the Navy, describing, and I quote, barefoot men and women linked together. I'm with you that it is an American innovation, but we must not exclude the triangular trade from the 18th century on down, and the Caribbean story. The typecase of Mr. Rochester in Jane Eyre probably held 3,000 human beings enslaved. Here is the cover of Eric Williams's book, Capitalism and Slavery, now followed by a contemporary photo of the capture of our own Birsa Munda. The real victims of the caste system are the collaborators made to collaborate. The black guy in Eric Williams' picture with the gun, or the Indian sepoys with guns who captured our Dalit leader Birsa Munda, standing in the center. Jack D. Forbes was brilliant in renaming North America as the Greater Caribbean. So I would say that we should actually expand. No conversation of this sort can end without a solid congratulation to Nicole Hannah-Jones for putting together 1619. Institutional blockages did not allow me to make contact with her, and I feel very sad. I'm saying it in public so that perhaps somehow I will get to at least engage in some conversation. And finally, over and over again, I hear how we ought to make sense out of what is happening. I think this is an admirable, altogether admirable attempt on the part of academics and intellectuals to deal with this production of knowledge. And we should continue to do it as well as we can. But I will say that there is no direct connection between knowledge and real change in the world, between knowledge and doing. That information is not knowing, and knowing is not learning. I cite myself as quoted by Anthony Appiah. I had forgotten that I had written this. I'm not that much interested in who speaks, but who listens. I think I would now like to hear questions, but I also would like to say that interaction, intersection, going together, connecting with other groups, that the class connection that I spoke of, how long it lasts, what we learn from Ife Charles. This is something that I would really like to hear questions about. But first from Yosan and Nwakego. Brent, before their questions, if you would please say just a few things about the fact that there is nothing called race. I say this because many years ago, when you were still a student, it was you who gave me a bibliography to consider this. I hope you don't feel put in a spot, and if you do, as an old friend, I'm putting you in a spot. Thank you. I put here a picture of Ambedkar speaking to the BBC because, if possible, I'd like to say something about that interview with the BBC. This is the picture. So now I think I will thank you once again. And as I said, it's not a speech I gave, it's just comments. And I hope this will produce some questions of interest to those who are attending this webinar, whom I cannot see. Thank you.
Thank you, Gayatri. You are putting me on the spot, and I don't remember the reading list. I have to find the reading list. I will throw out one thing. I don't think I can respond to that quickly, but I will think about it, and maybe I can dive back in later. That one question that I wanted to throw on the table that was riffling through your talk was not so much in terms of thinking race, but more in terms of thinking class. I would not be the first to say that Isabel Wilkerson's book, as wonderful and provocative as it is surprisingly and troublingly tacit on the category of class. It's not for nothing that if, as you pointed out, Du Bois gravitates toward the language of caste in a book like Black Reconstruction, he nonetheless also adopts, in his own provocation, a Marxian vocabulary of caste and class consciousness, the general strike, etc., the proletariat. So it came up in the way you were talking through the Wilkerson book, but this is a broader topic that maybe we can come back to. Let me think about my or try to dredge up on my computer my bibliography in terms of race, and turn it over to Nwakego and Yosan. I know that you have talked to each other and decided how you wanted to proceed. So however you'd like to take it, whichever one of you would like to start.
I will start. Thank you, Professor Spivak, for those comments. I wanted to start with Wilkerson's book, actually. I know you just asked Brent why he thought race doesn't exist. And thinking of Wilkerson's book, you know, she says that race is not a sufficient enough term to describe what is going on in the US, and that caste is more applicable. I'm wondering what you think it might mean, or what changes if we here in the US begin to reconfigure our lenses to view society as structured by caste instead of by race. Does it challenge any existing viewpoints we have about race and racism? And what do we potentially gain by viewing society in terms of caste instead of race?
Great question. I'll collect how many, Brent?
Well, they decided how they wanted to proceed. So are you going to go back and forth, or do you each have a list of questions? You should decide how you want to do it. Maybe
I generally take more than one, because otherwise, you know, I'm so long-winded that I keep on, you know.
Maybe the two of you should give 2 or 3 each. Give a handful and then let Gayatri respond. Does that sound okay?
Yeah, I think that works. In that case, I'll just add, I guess, 2 other questions. I would say you know, given everything that's been going on recently, there's a lot of emphasis on being anti-racist and doing anti-racist work, which is to say not just passively, you know, declaring that you are not a racist, but, you know, actively working towards dismantling racism and racist structures. Since we're talking about caste, you know, like what could it potentially look like to be anti-caste in 2020? What type of work is being done and what can we do collectively? And then lastly, since, you know, this talk's supposed to be about Isaac Woodard, you know, and hearing you talk about his ordeal and reading up on it as well, as shocking as it was to hear about his blinding and the police brutality that happened to him, it also is not unfamiliar given everything that's been going on, you know, in our current moment. So I'm wondering, you know, what you might think of this current conversation that a lot of activists have been having in terms of defunding or just straight up abolishing the police and imagining what cities could look like without them. Like, what are your thoughts on that?
Okay, so Yosan, you will wait or you will give me some questions. I'm writing them down.
I could ask you more questions, if that's fine.
Okay.
I have one question concerning like the question of like academia and our role as both students and your role as a professor. And I know like you're very concerned about like educating and teaching people how to read well. And so my question was, what can we do as people in these institutions, and what can't or shouldn't we do? That's one question. And then also I wanted to ask, or to ask you about like the problem.
You know, I'm not hearing
relevant
because my internet is not good. I live in Washington Heights in a very old building, which is kind of rent-controlled building. And so in spite of all expenditures, my internet quite often just goes off. So
I think it was Yosan's internet actually, because I heard that. Just repeat it again. You got garbled for a second.
repeat.
Where should I start?
Our role as readers, what can't and shouldn't we do? And then in another one.
Just wanted to hear your take on like the problems of producing like knowledge within like the university, and like also like the question of like the humanities. Do you think like humanities are in crisis? Because we're moving, like there's a lot of talk about like digital humanities, and like just wanted to hear your take on that within like the current like political climate or the like the present moment, and like what can we do as both teachers and students?
Okay, anything else?
Also, I have a question about identity and like recognition, and was wondering whether you think identity or so-called identity politics harms us more than it helps us. And then on the question of class, as Professor Edwards was briefly mentioning, I was just wondering how do you think like we should learn to redefine class in like new terms, because like class is always shifting and it's like very different than it was before, or like the definitions for it. And then how can we find or look for class differently and think about it differently?
Okay, so let me try, and please don't let me just go from one answer to another. You know when you're going to open the floor, but while I'm giving these answers, if you want to interrupt and comment or whatever, you do so, okay? Nwakego and Yosan and Brent, indeed. Okay, so class, because the moment you go into class, you see that which is why Du Bois was so fantastic about poor whites. He was amazing about poor whites. It's just, of course it's true that whites get historical privilege. That's just down the line. But on the other hand, if you look at, for example, the story called Breast Giver by Mahasweta, the woman who is the servant slaving away, she's supposedly a Brahmin. So I could give many examples of this. class is hard to think about because it's been very well theorized and developed beyond Marx, and Du Bois himself developed it beyond Marx when he said that the so-called fugitive slaves, whom Butler called contraband, that they were in fact undertaking a general strike. He changed Marx. People don't concentrate on it, but the thing is that you need to have class consciousness. Otherwise, you're not a class. So remember that description in the 18 Brumaire by Marx, that they were not a class. They were a class because of the economic similarities, small peasant proprietors. But they were not a class because they could not make their voices heard. There was no class consciousness. So the question of how class consciousness comes about is a complicated question. And I will say this, that Rosa Luxemburg's idea of spontaneity, which people don't understand, it's really, there's so much oppression that through the experience of unbelievable oppression, a kind of general consciousness, a collective consciousness, which perhaps the person can't theorize, but does it matter? A kind of general consciousness begins to emerge so that something, this is what we saw in Tunisia, that the subaltern really spoke because there was a general consciousness. And that's what's happening now. This Black Lives Matter going on toward, and I'll come to your question, Nwakego, going on toward the questioning of the police, systemic racism. What I see there is a kind of spontaneous, according to the Rosa Luxemburg definition, a kind of spontaneous emergence of what is basically, you can't keep these things separate. What is basically a race class consciousness. That's what's coming up, where in fact class is given, and this Du Bois writes about a great deal, that capital takes race as an ideology, and therefore it works as race. But if you look at it, and this Nwakego's work is very important here, that she's begun, and I hope she will continue. So this particular thing, it's hard to talk about, whereas you can see caste as just simply a visible hierarchy. And I don't think it is, in fact, a visible hierarchy in India. If I had more time, I would show pictures of myself with these untouchables. It would be hard to distinguish them just by looking at them as untouchables. But anyway, so I think that this is a kind of beginning of I think in fact what she is talking about is class. Class is avoided, for example, by Piketty. Class is a hard thing to talk about because most people think class is just rich and poor, but that ain't so. So how are you going to think it through? It's easier to put it on caste. So therefore, Nwakego's question, what is in it if it is caste, not race? I would like to say that we should learn from Wilkerson's book, because after all, this is not a country where everybody is, socialism here is in fact a bit of a dirty word. Not for the Black Lives Matter movement, but it's a dirty word. The idea of caste, therefore, can be very helpful. It can be helpful, and I think we should use it. But I think for me, the question is the idea that some human beings are naturally less human than others, which is basically the race argument. It is also the caste argument, but it's the race argument, the color line that Du Bois talks about. It is a race argument in a much stronger way. So I do not think we should just think about caste. Caste is a good thing to think about because class is hard to think about. Isn't that so? And it is true that they see, I don't think white is a color. I don't think male is a set of genitals. I think they are attitudes. And so, but this is a complicated thing unless you also think caste. Unless you also think caste. So I would say, Nwakego, for me, class is a more powerful tool to think with. And it's good to bring caste into it. Because it's not neither race nor class, but something in between. How to be anti-casteist in 2020. Well, that's a hard one, because what I was talking about in terms of my schools, that is a way of being anti-casteist. I say to my students, and I wish they could be, of course they don't understand English, but I wish, I could very easily bring them in. I talk to them all the time, but I say to them, I am your enemy. I am good, I think so, and my parents were good, they thought so. But 2 generations do not undo thousands of years of the refusal of intellectual labor. And in a piece that I think directly confronts my work in an Indian context called Margins and Marginalization, I begin by saying that my first act of liberation, as I understand it, is access to intellectual labor, which is so incredibly difficult to restore when it has been taken away. That you don't know, you can't know, I know. That particular situation is so difficult. I can't say very much more than this right now, because caste in the Indian context, it's different in Northeast, it's different in the South, already in India. And so if you bring it into Southern Mississippi, and if you bring it into Brooklyn, it's a very different scene. So that I don't think it would be correct for someone like me who works individually as well as collectively to, in fact, I'm not even interested in giving a broad method, because it's never followed. People say that they're following it, but even if they make policy, as I said, law is not justice. So therefore, I would say this much. And as for defunding, I think, I am myself, of course, for the a complete rethinking of what the police are about here. But you see, my way is a very different way. I'm not, in order to listen to what I'm saying, you have to be a different kind of activist. Everybody can't do this kind of stuff, but I have to say what I'm saying. I say again and again that the enforcers of the law, and this very much in the Indian context, suffer from the same class apartheid in education. And therefore, we cannot expect them. That's why I said it's not just training. We cannot expect them when even people at the top think rape culture and bribe culture are normal. We do not represent the world. And in fact, even in our context, when I'm asked to write a recommendation letter, the student asks me to prove that he or she is better than all his other or hers other students who took the class. It has a connection in a taxonomy of a culture where my words will somehow bribe the employer to offer a job because this student is better than all the other students in this particular situation. This is not a trivial example. That's why I say complicity. We are folded together. So therefore, we who teach at elite schools, research schools, etc., we must think of the fact that the police, in fact, who are the police? Like people who have no power in society are given the possibility of having a gun. Why do we then, we have those big, wonderful words. My father really wanted to serve and protect. Very nice, very good. Perhaps my father did do it. He was an unusual man. But if you're thinking as a group, you have to think about the fact that we must go below the idea of, this is why I was saying education sustained, persistent. This is why I was quoting Ife Charles, that, and it is, we have to think as much about the enforcers in this way. Otherwise, this is not going to be changed. I think because in this country, quite often fundraising is considered activism. The word defunding came out of a certain kind of rage. And I honor the word, I understand the word, but I think strategically it was a bad word. The idea of also putting community training, etc. Training is not what we're at here. This is the only thing that I can offer here is a very long-term situation. The short-term situation is to somehow make it possible that they be judged according to the same laws. This is not becoming possible. I showed in those two pictures, I said the worst victims are the collaborators. We know, as we are sitting here thinking, who the collaborators are in the country now. So therefore, obviously, this is, I'm not going to turn this into a political discussion, but your question encourages a political answer. So that's what I would say about that briefly here. And Yosan, I do not know what you cannot or should not do. I generally say your role as readers, you know, reading, as I have often said, is not taught anymore. What is taught is, you know, like so-called narrative. And, you know, the idea that in order to read, you have to undo yourself. It's very scary. And you have to hang out in the other text. This is the basis of practice for the ethical reflex. This is not done anymore. We only want to know, we want to make sense out of, we want to give our understanding, and so on and so forth. Our role as readers, you have heard me talk about readers. And that's what I call the literary, right? That you have to go toward the other text rather than, and not always, not every waking minute, but this is the training. So that's the reading stuff, which I can't talk about too much because it doesn't have something to do right about understanding systemic racism. But what cannot and shouldn't we do? I have no idea. I have no idea what you shouldn't or cannot do. You know, when I'm asked that, I have to know you very much better in order to move with you, to see what, I mean, that cannot and should not. That's a different kind of teaching from the kind of teaching we do at a Research One university in the United States. It's a very different kind of teaching. It's a kind of living with type teaching. And so I would say that when people ask me about activism, I say just go and look at the demonstrations and go join a demonstration. A demonstration is a very good thing. And from the demonstration, you will get some sense of what is more than just marching. If you don't get that sense, then you will have to somehow train yourself to do that. I don't think I'm going to say be an activist in my way, but find it like this. You have to find it yourself. And so I have told you something about the problems of producing knowledge. I will just direct you to the only blog I've ever written. No, I've written two blogs. One was for Bernard Harcourt on revolution, and the other one was to the World Economic Forum when I was on their ethics committee or values committee. What I said to them was that knowledge management kind of knowledge that we teach in education, you know, we won this innovative course prize. This is all knowledge management. The knowledge management type of education which produces toolkits and so on this cannot be a matrix for any kind of ethical work. The idea of the ethical work has to be to rear the students in a certain way, I used to say cook the soul, but somebody told me that that sounds corrupt, so I can't use that anymore. I must find another metaphor, so that the person who is using the digital on tap rather than on top knows where to stop and knows not to use it to save intellectual labor. That's something that I did write in this blog about cooking the soul, and that's all I can say at this point. I think myself that identity politics is not a good thing. I think that what should happen, we should certainly, I mean, you know, we are tuned to love a certain kind of identity, and that's fine, but that cannot be the basis, especially if we're intellectuals, that cannot be the basis of our understanding of the world. I mean, I go, you know, Du Bois, again at the beginning, I am working on him, so he's on my mind all the time. At the beginning of The Dusk of Dawn, he says he apologizes, and I think that is so important. He apologizes because he can only base his remarks on his own experience. He goes ahead and does so. He says, I'm speaking from behind the veil, but he apologizes. This is so powerful. I mean, we cannot help being somewhat happy about what we are. I hope, in fact, it's a vague kind of thing, but our real effort is to go away from it so that my identity is everyone else's identity. I can't do it, but one must work as hard as possible. I was, you know, I'm an atheist. I was in Egypt recently, and as I was talking, because the two guys who were in my cab, the cab driver and another guy, as I was talking, I could see that they didn't know much about Shias. I mean, they knew that Shias and Sunnis should fight, but they didn't know much about Shias. So I was talking about Hassan Hussein, I was talking about Muharram, I was talking about Yar and so on and so forth. And so one of the guy asks, are you Shia or Sunni? I thought I had passed an exam. I really thought I had passed an exam. You know, this thing, I would say to the guys when I did paramedical work in Bangladesh, they would say, oh, you know, my son has so many children because it's Allah's hand and so on. So I would say to them, okay, it's Allah's hand. But you because I was so old, white hair, I could say anything, right? It's Allah's hand. But you put your son under the bed and you put your daughter-in-law on top of the bed. Okay, that's how they sleep. Would Allah's hand work? So, you know, they also thought I was Muslim, because if they didn't, given Islamophobia, if they didn't think the way I was talking that I was Muslim, I would not be able to speak to them. So to an extent, when we want recognition, then we are, of course, responding reactively to injustice that's being done to us. That is important. Black lives matter. Black lives matter. But we must remember that without saying all lives matter and undoing the power of the movement, we must remember that this is where we have been put by centuries of racism. This is not who we are. So remember what I was saying to you, Yosan, in the class, to all of you. And of course, I didn't get the chance to ask you what to do with binary oppositions. This is called a double bind. This is called the fact that you have to learn how to play contradictions, rather than, play is a strong word here, it's the name for practice, rather than just simply go for, and I don't want recognition. Who has the power to recognize anyone? You know what I mean? I want the law, knowing that law finally is not justice. There must be this persistent other work at the same time. I don't want just recognition. Recognition is a pat on the back. It's easy to say. It's easy to say. But push comes to shove, it ain't there anymore. So, and of course, when you have this kind of voting block, then it becomes divisive. So that there's a Latinx vote, there's a Black vote, there's a women's vote. The thing to do is to vote for the issues together, rather than just for our own interests. But once again, I'll say, Black Lives Matter is such a spontaneous eruption of the undoing of an injustice for centuries on down, that it has to, its demand for recognition is no longer recognition in the ordinary sense. I'm learning every day from what's happening. I have a whole file from which I quoted because when I was enraged, of what I'm learning as this unfolds. It's a new thing. So therefore, everything I have said, I hope perhaps to unlearn in order to learn better what to do. I'm glad that you asked me to open this thing, but I think I've answered most of the questions now, Brent, haven't I? Unless
You have. We could, Nwakego and Yosan, do you want to keep going, or should we bring in questions from the Q&A? I did think of an answer to your question, Gayatri, from before, but we're also nearing a stopping place.
So do you just say it and then open it?
Why don't we say it and I'll say it and then we can take one question. It's not a simple or direct answer. Race, the simple part of it is that there's no biological basis for race, and that race is an imaginary construct with real effects. In relation to the Wilkerson framework, to me, the question that kind of comes between, it's not an identity politics question, but another way of phrasing Nwakego's question, rather than what is anti-caste now, can we think, if Wilkerson's project, she describes it as recalibrating how we see ourselves, which has a relationship to what you describe as recalibrating minds.
And in fact, I'll give you my phrase, epistemological performance. How we think of ourselves as knowers and what we think we know. That's how I write in aesthetic education, recalibrating ourselves.
Well, my question in terms of the utility of the term caste is, can we think towards something like a category of caste consciousness? Because you could argue, despite the imaginary status of race, on the flip side, racial consciousness has played a crucial political role. Political activism, civil rights, social justice work. It's what people who are put in that position do in organizing. I mean, this is the difference between, this is Black Reconstruction to Dusk of Dawn in Du Bois, where 5 years later, Du Bois in Dusk of Dawn is arguing for a kind of Black separatism and Black economic self-sufficiency. Yes. So it's racial consciousness and a kind of collaboration among raced individuals under what she's describing as a caste regime that leads to that. And that's the place where race and class touch in this interesting way, relating to those two questions. Looking forward, can you think, I don't think Wilkerson is proposing something like a caste consciousness as being possible, if we're thinking towards a solution here.
But I'll tell you what I say to my students in Birbhum. You know, it's not just that there is no biological basis for race, but ... There is no basis for caste. It's an absurd situation, you know, and so that's what I tell them. I said, look, I mean, this is, of course, I'm speaking to them and not to you, but I tell them, look, if there were castes, don't you think there would be castes all over the world? Why is it that there is no caste all over the world? You see, it is truly, truly absurd. There is no, I mean, there is nothing, I mean, there is caste consciousness. I mean, the people that Etienne was a bit angry that I was never mentioning post-coloniality when I was describing this work, because they had not seen white people. When they saw Ben, they thought that he had a disease. And then, you know, when they went to Calcutta, and there were some very good-hearted white people who wanted to see what tribals were like, they came back and said, you know, there were these people, white of skin and golden of hair, and they were following us all the time. So now they don't have any, I mean, if it's, people here have already forgotten Vietnam, how can one expect these people to remember colonialism? I mean, it doesn't mean anything, but the caste system absolutely means something. There is caste consciousness. It's just that caste consciousness is extremely complicated. There is a caste hostility and caste acceptance. You know, I mean, here I am. I live with them. I sleep in the same room. You know, I drink. I've been drinking water. I've been threatened by the Brahmins and this and that. You know, they said we sleep 17 men in the next room. No one will kill you, etc., etc. I mean, I am with them, okay? And on the other hand, one day we're eating together as usual, and you know, their tomatoes, there's no genetic anything, right? Absolutely. I mean, they're red like you wouldn't believe. And I love tomatoes. So we're all eating. And beside me is Shuni Lohar, and he hasn't eaten a slice of tomato. It's on the side of his plate, okay? It isn't like it's all mixed up. It's just on the side of his plate, almost untouched. And we're sitting together, okay? And I pick it up and I eat it. And a grave silence descends on this little area. You know, it's like a clay court, right? And I start laughing. I say, you people, you still believe I'm a Brahmin and better than you, and you have sinned because I ate from your plate, because they're also very complicated eating rules, right? So therefore, I mean, I had to say to Bimal Motilal, who was one of the greatest Sanskritists in the world, when he was sick and his mother came to help him, she wasn't letting me help her. And finally, I had to say to him, Auntie, I know the eating rules. Don't worry, I won't make a mistake. And so, I mean, there is caste consciousness. It's just, I mean, all the Dalit movement, in fact, is caste consciousness. It's very localized. And in my neck of the woods, they don't even know the word Dalit. So it's something that has to be thought through. But Dalit is a Sanskrit word, as you know, which doesn't in fact mean quite what Wilkerson makes it mean. But at any rate, so caste consciousness, I don't think is going to lead to the kind of thing that, because there is acceptance of this as normality. No, I'm not good enough. I'm not good enough. So that's a hard one to deal with. And it's so complicated. There are thousands of castes, Brent. So it's like, what will you be conscious of? You know? And well, I wish I could talk about castes, but that would take me somewhere.
Well, I mean, we can keep going. Do you want to take a question from the Q&A? Or should we stop there?
Do you run it?
Why don't we take one and stop there? If Yosan and Nwakego, are you okay with that? To take one from the Q&A?
And so that will be the end of the webinar, is what you're saying.
If you're okay with that, I think that makes sense.
Completely okay.
Yeah, what I was saying in terms of caste and race, it's just to agree with you that there is caste consciousness in the way you're describing, but it cannot be a solution. It cannot be a way of recalibrating minds.
No, and also the idea of class consciousness is very difficult, and caste consciousness is there, but in a very variegated way. I mean, you know, people say about me that I cannot understand the poetry of Binay Majumdar, who wrote to me his extraordinary sonnet sequence, etc., in 1961, and changed the direction of Bengali poetry, because I'm a Brahmin and he's a Namashudra. We didn't know anything about it. We were not working within caste. But academics, envious of me, now say that I'm so determined by the fact that I was born a Brahmin that I can't understand this poetry. This is caste consciousness working the other way. Can you imagine? And someone up in the government, you know, the Home Secretary, tells me this story. It's a very amazing thing, caste consciousness.
One question from the Q&A, and I'll let you choose, Gayatri. There are a couple of questions from Sylvie Kande. Can you see the questions from Q&A?
No.
There's one from Yuru Zong who says, who asks you to talk about the BBC interview. I'm not sure what that's a reference to. And one of Sylvie Kande's is, this is a complex one. If African ethnicities are the equivalent of the caste system in India, where does that leave the caste system in West Africa, notably?
Okay.
You want to take one of those?
Yes. Well, I'll take the BBC. I'm not saying the the caste system is like the ethnic system, but I think inter-ethnic conflict is like caste conflict, somewhat like, because it's internecine. Everybody is black, and yet, you know, before elections, there's ethnic violence, etc. I don't want to. It's such a complicated question that I don't want to trivialize it by trying to answer it, you know, in a quick and easy way. But it's a very, very important question, and I'm in Ghana a lot, so I would want to answer it, but I think we talked too long. As for Ambedkar, that's the last picture I had, right? Okay, you notice that Ambedkar is like dressed very sort of carelessly, as it were, and he really knew where to speak how. And the BBC guy is trying to make him, you know, make him say, aren't elections wonderful? Isn't the vote wonderful? And he is saying, by that time, he's saying to the BBC guy, this is not something he would say to his Dalit co-workers in India. He's saying to the BBC guy, no, because India has not, because at that time he had a sense of failure, because the Indian mindset is not democratic. I mean, you should listen to the whole thing. The Indian mindset is not democratic. Therefore, elections will not bring anything to any real change. It will be just body count. I mean, he is amazing to the BBC guy. And the BBC guy is thinking, my God, is Ambedkar really saying that elections are no good? No, he can't say that. But of course, that's not what he means. He means in India, there is not the democratic consciousness yet, so that you can't just go and vote. They are not ready for democracy, is what he was saying there. And so, I mean, you should see the whole interview. That's what I wanted to say, that we should hear him speaking to the BBC. You know, every time I hear that thing, Jai Bhim, I cringe, because that's exactly the kind of thing that he was against. We have turned him, because we don't have enough democratic consciousness and we're turning into a theocracy today. We have turned him into one of those ancestor worship kind of guys. So I feel very strongly about him. And as I say, I have written about the fact that the date between Du Bois and Ambedkar did not, in fact, it was a failed date. And I've tried to be as careful as possible. Thank you for your question. I hope I did not give too negative an answer. I just love the expressions on the two faces in this picture. So, is that it?
I think that is it. That is a place, if Nwakego and Yosan are okay, this is a place we can stop. And I want to first of all thank Gayatri Spivak, but also to thank our students, Nwakego and Yosan, for those wonderful, very difficult questions, and to thank our audience that we can't thank in person, but nonetheless, it is nice to be in your presence. There are 80 people in the virtual room. I think this, and coming back to Ambedkar at the end, it's actually an appropriate way to kick off the series, the Ambedkar Initiative series. So thank you for joining us, and have a good weekend.
And all of you, thank you. Have a good weekend.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Good night, guys.
Good night.